The chainsaw started at 7:30 on a Thursday morning, metal teeth ripping through wood that had stood for 3 generations. My grandfather's fence, the boundary of our family farm since 1952, was systematically destroyed while a woman in a tailored blazer checked items off her clipboard. HOA regulations, she said without looking up. 3-foot maximum height. Half my fence was already gone before I could even pull my boots on. But that day, standing in my field watching them tear apart my property, I had no idea that buried in my grandfather's papers was the one legal document that would not only save my farm, but expose their entire corrupt operation. The question burning inside me was simple. What gives anyone the right to destroy a farmer's livelihood while hiding behind neighborhood rules that never should have applied to my land in the first place? My name is Tom Miller. I've spent 55 years on this earth, 40 of them working this land with these hands. Until 6 months ago, I lived by the code my father hammered into me and his father before him. Work hard, respect tradition, defend what's yours, and mind your own business unless someone isn't minding theirs. 3 generations of Millers have sweated and bled into this soil at Willow Creek Farm. We've weathered storms, droughts, recessions, and government regulations. But nothing prepared me for the day corporate greed armed itself with neighborhood bylaws and chainsaws, teaching me what my grandfather knew from war. Sometimes you must fight for what's rightfully yours. This land became Miller land when my grandfather returned from Korea in 1952, carrying shrapnel in his leg and nightmares he never discussed. Standing on the East Hill, he gripped my grandmother's hand and pointed across 40 acres of possibility. "This is where our children will be safe," he promised, the only time I'm told his voice ever broke. That very afternoon, despite his injuries, he drove the first fence post by hand, a sacred moment captured in a Kodachrome photograph that's outlasted 3 weddings and 2 funerals above our fireplace. In that image, he stands in his army jacket, sleeves rolled up, dog tag still hanging against his chest. His face looks young, but his eyes. Those eyes had already seen what men will do when there are no boundaries to respect. That fence wasn't just wood and nails to him. It was his line in the sand, his promise that some things in this world remain unbroken, even when men are. Over the decades, the Miller family worked this land through drought and flood, through economic booms and recessions. We raised cattle, grew alfalfa, and in good years, harvested enough corn to sell the surplus. We weren't wealthy by any measure, but the farm provided, and we were proud to be part of the agricultural backbone of Liberty County. The landscape around us changed gradually. The Pattersons sold their dairy operation to a housing development in the 90s. The old McAllister place became a strip mall in the early 2000s. But our little corner remained largely untouched, a working farm surrounded by the creeping expansion of suburban life. That changed dramatically 2 years ago when James Johnson, our neighbor to the west for nearly 4 decades, passed away at 92. His children, living in California and having no interest in rural life, sold the entire 60-acre property to Meridian Development Group. Within weeks, surveyors were mapping the land. Within months, bulldozers had cleared every tree and leveled every rise. Signs went up advertising Meadow Vista Estates, luxury country living starting at $499,000. The irony of bulldozing actual countryside to create country living wasn't lost on me, but I try to keep an open mind. Change happens. Progress, they call it. The first few families who moved in seemed pleasant enough. City folks looking for cleaner air and more space. They'd wave as they drove past my fence on their morning commutes. Some even stopped to let their kids pet the calves when they were near the road in spring. The Homeowners Association formed almost immediately, as these things tend to do. Initially, relations were cordial if distant. I received a Christmas card from the HOA board that first year with a note expressing how much they valued the authentic rural character I brought to the area. I remember chuckling at that, as if my family working this land for 7 decades was some kind of rustic amenity for their development. Little did I know that my traditional wooden rail fence would soon become the flashpoint in a conflict that would test not just my patience, but my understanding of property rights, community values, and how far some people will go to get their way. Elizabeth Harrington, the architect of my nightmare, arrived 18 months after the development broke ground, moving into the largest home in Meadow Vista Estates. Her white Mercedes SUV with vanity plates reading PRPRTY told me everything I needed to know. At the community mailboxes, she distributed campaign flyers with manicured hands and a smile that never reached her eyes. Despite not being part of their HOA, a glossy brochure appeared in my box promising to aggressively protect property values through consistent standards enforcement. The campaign photos showed Elizabeth and her husband, a real estate executive, I'd later discover, standing before their pristine home, their artificial smiles promising perfection through elimination of community eyesores. I should have recognized the predatory gleam in her eyes then. The fence my grandfather built was already in her crosshairs. She won in a landslide from what I heard. The previous HOA president, a retired teacher named David, had been too permissive according to certain residents. Elizabeth's first act was to triple the HOA's legal retainer and establish a compliance committee with the power to issue violation notices without full board approval. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday in early April. I almost mistook it for junk mail with its official-looking envelope and important community notification stamped across the front. Inside, heavy cardstock bore the Meadow Vista Estates logo, a stylized tree and sunset that looked nothing like the actual landscape, and a formal notice. Dear property owner, it has come to our attention that the fence structure on your property adjacent to Meadow Vista Estates exceeds the maximum height restriction of 36 inches as specified in Community Covenant Section 7.3.2. According to our measurements, your fence stands at approximately 54 inches, representing a significant violation of community standards. As this structure impacts the aesthetic harmony of our neighborhood and potentially affects property values, we kindly request that you bring this fence into compliance within 30 days of this notice. I chuckled and tossed it in my junk drawer. My farm wasn't part of their development, and their rules had no bearing on my property. The fence had stood at that height since before Elizabeth Harrington was born, and it would remain that way long after she'd moved on to some other pristine neighborhood to regulate. 2 weeks later, a second letter arrived, this one on even heavier cardstock with a red final notice watermark. The language had shifted from kindly request to must comply, and it now included a threat of daily fines. $100 per day beginning May 15th, potentially accumulating to thousands if left unaddressed. This one I didn't toss away. Instead, I called my neighbor Bill Jenkins, whose family had farmed the land east of mine since the 1960s. Are you getting these too? I asked after explaining the situation. Not yet, Bill said. But I heard the Wilsons got cited for their tractor being visible from Meadow Vista Road. And the Hendersons, they've got that beautiful old barn from the 1930s. They got some notice about unauthorized agricultural structures or some nonsense. I decided to face this HOA directly, not as a supplicant, but as a landowner defending his rights. Their meeting was held in the ironically named Meadow Vista Community Center, a sterile box with plastic rustic beams and a gas fireplace that, like everything else about this place, was just for show. I entered wearing the same work-worn Carhartt jacket my father had given me 20 years ago, soil still embedded in its seams. The room fell silent as I crossed the threshold, a living reminder of the authentic rural life they pretended to value in their brochures. Among pressed khakis and department store casual wear, I stood like a piece of actual countryside that had tracked mud onto their sanitized simulation. Elizabeth sat centered at a U-shaped table, her practiced smile evaporating when she saw me. What shocked me wasn't her disdain. I expected that, but the document I glimpsed on her tablet as she hastily turned it over. Architectural renderings of Meadow Vista Phase 2 sprawling across what was unmistakably my property. This wasn't about my fence. They were already planning to build on my land before they'd even approached me to sell. When public comments began, I approached the microphone and introduced myself, explaining that while I appreciated their community standards, my property was not subject to their covenants. Mr. Miller, Elizabeth interrupted, adjusting her glasses with manicured fingers. While we respect the Rustic charm you're attempting to maintain. Your non-conforming fence is clearly visible from 12 properties in our community, directly impacting their enjoyment and value. Ma'am, my farm has been here for 70 years. The fence is necessary for containing livestock, and the aesthetics of pre-existing structures must still comply with county ordinances, she cut in, and our legal counsel has confirmed that perimeter structures visible from our community fall under our remediation authority. I tried again. That fence has stood since before your subdivision was even conceived. It's part of a working farm, not a decorative element. Her smile tightened, never reaching her eyes. The board has made its determination, Mr. Miller. You have until May 15th to comply. As I turned to leave, frustration building, I heard her add in a voice meant to carry, "We'll see about that fence one way or another." Walking to my truck, I was approached by an older gentleman who introduced himself as Robert Shun, a retired attorney who'd recently moved to Meadow Vista. "That was handled poorly," he said quietly. "For what it's worth, I don't think she has the authority she claims. But be careful, Elizabeth doesn't respond well to challenges." His warning proved more prophetic than either of us could have imagined. The morning of May 13th, 2 days before their arbitrary deadline, I was in the kitchen pouring coffee when the unmistakable sound of chainsaws shattered the dawn quiet. Not the distant buzz of normal property maintenance, but close, too close. On my property, I rushed outside in my work clothes, blue checkered shirt, denim pants, and the worn baseball cap I've had for years to find 3 men in neon yellow vests systematically cutting through my fence rails. They worked with mechanical precision, measuring exactly 36 inches from the ground before making each cut, leaving the bottom structure intact while removing the upper rails. And there she was, Elizabeth Harrington, clipboard in hand, designer sunglasses perched on her nose despite the cloudy morning, supervising the destruction of my property. She stood just inside the subdivision boundary, maintaining plausible deniability while directing the operation. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" I shouted, my voice cracking with a rage I barely recognized. The workers paused momentarily, looking to Elizabeth for direction. She stepped forward, maintaining a careful distance, her posture communicating authority without technically trespassing. "Bringing your fence into compliance, Mr. Miller. We've provided ample notice, and the deadline is approaching." Her tone was clinical, as if explaining a minor paperwork issue. "This is private property. You have no right to touch my fence." I moved toward the nearest worker, who stepped back, chainsaw idling. "Actually," Elizabeth interjected, gesturing to one of the contractors who produced an official-looking document from a work truck. "The HOA has enforcement rights for community standards violations." Section 4, Paragraph 7 of the county ordinance allows for remediation of non-compliant structures affecting subdivision aesthetics. I snatched the document from his hands and scanned it furiously. "This is from Meadow Vista Properties. My farm isn't part of your development." Elizabeth's expression didn't change. "Your property borders our community, directly affecting our aesthetics and values. The county enforcement officer approved our action plan yesterday." She pulled out her phone, displaying what appeared to be an official email with a county letterhead. "I never received any notice from the county. The notice was sent to the property owner of record," she replied smoothly. "Perhaps you should update your contact information with the assessor's office." By now, neighbors from Meadow Vista were emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Some still in bathrobes, clutching coffee mugs, others dressed for work, but pausing to watch the drama unfold. My fence, my grandfather's fence, was being systematically destroyed in front of an audience of strangers. 3 feet is the maximum allowable height, Elizabeth continued, pointing to where they'd precisely measured and cut. "We're simply enforcing the rules everyone else follows." I advanced, blood pounding in my ears, decades of Miller's stubbornness rising like a tide. "You leave my property now, or I'm calling the sheriff." She didn't flinch, but something flashed behind her eyes, calculation. "By all means." She turned her phone toward the growing crowd of neighbors in bathrobes, displaying what appeared to be an official county email. "We have proper authorization." Her voice carried perfectly, This was theater for the audience she'd anticipated. 20 feet down, a worker positioned his chainsaw at another section of my fence. I planted myself directly in his path, close enough to smell chainsaw oil and sweat. "This is MY property," I growled. "My grandfather built this fence before your parents were born." The worker hesitated, glancing nervously between us. "Ma'am, he's refusing permission." "I don't think we should. You have county authorization." She cut him off, voice sharp as a blade. "Continue as planned." She stepped closer, lowering her voice for my ears only. "Fight this, and you'll lose everything, Mr. Miller. Your fence is just the beginning." The threat hung between us, invisible to onlookers, but as real as the chainsaw's teeth. This wasn't about compliance, it was intimidation. And suddenly I understood the game being played on my land. As if to punctuate her authority, a small section of the severed fence suddenly collapsed entirely, sending the top rails tumbling down the slight incline toward my grazing field. A gasp went up from the onlookers. Elizabeth's expression betrayed a moment of alarm. This wasn't part of the plan, but she quickly composed herself. "We'll note the structural damage for our records," she said clinically, making a show of writing something on her clipboard. "This is for the good of the community," she added, her voice carrying so the gathering neighbors could hear her clearly. "Property values affect everyone." I pulled out my phone and dialed the sheriff's office, explaining the situation as calmly as I could manage. The dispatcher promised to send someone, but couldn't say how long it might take. While waiting, I approached several subdivision residents who had gathered to watch. Most avoided eye contact, uncomfortable with the confrontation, but unwilling to intervene. One woman whispered, "I've voted against this," before quickly walking away. By the time Deputy Wallace arrived 40 minutes later, nearly 60 feet of my fence had been cut down to exactly 3 feet high, with the severed upper portion scattered on the ground. The deputy reviewed Elizabeth's documentation, frowned, and pulled her aside for a private conversation. I couldn't hear their exchange, but I could see Elizabeth's body language shift from confidence to defensiveness. The deputy returned to me, looking troubled. "Mr. Miller, the situation is complicated. They do appear to have some form of county approval, but I'm not convinced it applies to agricultural property like yours. I strongly suggest you contact the county planning department immediately and possibly get legal advice." "So you're not stopping them?" I asked incredulously. "Without a court order contradicting their authorization, my hands are tied," he admitted. "But I'm documenting everything, and I've instructed them not to remove any materials from your property, only to modify the existing structure as their document specifies." As Deputy Wallace left, Elizabeth's smug expression told me everything I needed to know. She'd won this round, not because she was right, but because she'd manipulated the system and caught me unprepared. By noon, they had finished their handiwork. 400 feet of my beautiful wooden rail fence reduced to exactly 3 feet high. The top rails lay scattered on the ground like fallen soldiers. The contractors packed up their equipment and left without meeting my eyes, leaving behind a property that looked as if it had been partially decapitated. Almost immediately, I noticed my cattle gathering near the compromised barrier, their natural curiosity drawing them to investigate the change. Even from a distance, I could see them testing the reduced height with gentle nudges. The fence had been precisely designed at 4.5 feet to contain full-grown cattle. At 3 feet, it was merely a suggestion rather than a barrier. I made emergency calls to neighboring farmers, explaining the situation. Within an hour, Bill Jenkins arrived with his 2 sons, and the Thompsons came shortly after. Together, we installed temporary wire fencing above the butchered rails, an ugly but necessary solution to contain my livestock. Without it, my entire herd might have wandered onto the pristine lawns of Meadow Vista by nightfall. "Never seen anything like this," Bill muttered as we worked. "Cutting a man's fence without proper authority. In my father's day, that would have been cause for." He stopped himself, hammering a staple with more force than necessary. As we worked, Bill pulled me aside. "Tom, this isn't the first time. Last month, she tried to force the Hendersons to tear down their heritage barn because it wasn't an approved outbuilding. Threatened liens on their property. What happened?" I asked, fixing another section of emergency wire. They caved, tore it down themselves. Couldn't afford the fight. Bill looked at me meaningfully. She's building her reputation on these victories, making examples of folks who don't fall in line. The attack on my fence struck like a financial avalanche. $600 for emergency repairs alone, and contractors quoting up to $10,200 for proper reconstruction. Money earmarked for the irrigation system our farm desperately needed, now diverted to fix deliberate damage. The true cost wasn't just dollars. That night, I heard coyotes howling closer than ever, testing the weakened boundary. I moved my vulnerable calves to the barn, sleep impossible as I patrolled the compromised perimeter. 3 generations of security destroyed in a single morning by bureaucrats who'd never worked a day of honest labor. My phone exploded with calls, farmers offering help, neighbors volunteering materials, even a Liberty County Gazette reporter hungry for a story about HOA overreach. I gripped the phone, rage burning in my throat, ready to unleash 70 years of Miller family stubbornness in a headline-grabbing tirade. Then my father's voice echoed in my memory. "Millers don't just get mad, son. We get even." "Not yet," I told the reporter, a strategy forming. This story's missing its final chapter. Meanwhile, the community reaction was splitting along predictable lines. Newer residents, particularly those who had supported Elizabeth's HOA campaign, defended the action as necessary standardization. Longtime locals, especially those from agricultural families, were uniformly outraged at what they viewed as an attack on farming heritage. Sarah Henderson, whose family had reluctantly demolished their historic barn, stopped by with a casserole. "We should have fought them," she said, her voice tight with regret. "But they wore us down with letters and threats until it seemed easier to give in. Don't make our mistake, Tom." That night, sleep wouldn't come. I sat at my grandfather's oak table, the same table where he'd planned harvests and weathered droughts for decades, and dragged his old metal filing cabinet from the office. The hinges protested with a screech that seemed to channel my own frustration. Inside were 5 decades of farm records, meticulously organized by a man who'd learned in Korea that details matter when your life's on the line. Faded deeds, water rights certificates, boundary surveys from 1952, each folder more yellow than the last. My fingers trembled slightly, the weight of 3 generations pressing down as I searched for something, anything, to fight back with. Near midnight, a folder labeled Township Ordinances, 1950 to 1960 caught my eye. Inside, wedged between tax notices, was a document I'd never seen, crisp and official despite its age. Liberty Township Agricultural Protection Covenant, 1953. My heart raced as I scanned the first paragraph. Agricultural properties shall be forever exempt from subsequent residential restrictions. I slammed my palm on the table, papers scattering. "Gotcha," I whispered to the empty kitchen, the first smile in days cracking across my face. Grandfather hadn't just built a fence, he'd fortified it with the law itself. Elizabeth Harrington had no idea what she'd started. The county records office opened at 8 a.m. I was waiting at the door at 7:45, a cardboard box of documents under my arm. Martha Gaines, who'd worked there since I was a boy, greeted me with a sympathetic smile. "Heard about your fence, Tom. Shameful what they did. How can I help?" I explained what I was looking for, any documentation about agricultural exemptions, grandfather structures, or limitations on HOA jurisdiction. Martha nodded knowingly and led me to a research terminal. "Start with the township charter," she suggested. Liberty Township was originally established as an agricultural district, and some of those provisions were never removed even as development increased. For 3 grueling hours, I dug through dusty property records and complex township charters, unearthing a critical discovery. My farm's one agricultural zoning carried entirely different legal protections than residential zones. The smoking gun had to be here somewhere. I called Robert Shun, the retired attorney who'd offered help after the HOA meeting. Within minutes, he connected me with Frank Williams, a property law specialist with a reputation for fighting and winning against corporate overreach. "I'll be there in an hour," Frank said, his voice carrying the edge of a man who smelled blood in the water. "Bring everything, especially your grandfather's original documents. These HOA vultures always miss something." Frank's dining room transformed into a war room. Documents spread across every surface. Through wire-rimmed glasses, he attacked each page with laser focus, occasionally letting out a soft whistle or murmuring, "They really didn't do their homework, did they?" After nearly 2 hours of silent review, he suddenly straightened in his chair. "Hold on," he said, excitement creeping into his voice. He pointed to a section in the original township charter I had overlooked. "Look here, Agricultural Land Exemption, Section 12.4. I leaned closer to read the faded text. "Established agricultural operations shall be preserved and protected from encroachment by residential development. No residential covenant or restriction shall impair the continued operation of existing agricultural enterprises within township boundaries." "And there's more," Frank said, pulling out another document. "The county's Rural Heritage Preservation Statute, enacted in 1987, specifically prohibits aesthetic enforcement against pre-existing agricultural structures." He highlighted the relevant section. "No aesthetic standard or uniform appearance requirement may be enforced against agricultural structures that predated the establishment of residential development within 1,000 yards of said structures." The most crucial discovery came buried in a subsection about grandfather clauses. Pre-existing agricultural properties were explicitly excluded from subdivision covenants created after their establishment. The language was unambiguous. No homeowners association or residential covenant may exercise enforcement authority over properties established and continuously operated as agricultural enterprises. But the true bombshell came when Frank examined the county approval Elizabeth had displayed on her phone. He requested a copy from the county planning office, and what he received was illuminating. "This is for standard boundary fence modifications between subdivision properties," he said, his voice rising with indignation. "The authorization specifically states for aesthetic compliance between covenant properties. It has nothing to do with agricultural land." He looked up at me, eyes wide. "Tom, she didn't just overstep, she deliberately misrepresented county authorization. This approval never applied to your farm." Frank continued digging, making calls to former colleagues still active in county government. What he discovered was shocking. The email Elizabeth had shown on her phone, the one with county letterhead that appeared to authorize the fence modification, didn't exist in county records. The formatting matched county communications, but the content had been altered. "Tom," Frank said solemnly, "she didn't just misrepresent existing authorization. I believe she may have fabricated government documentation to give the appearance of county approval. That's not just overreach. That potentially crosses into criminal misrepresentation." That exact moment when I realized the HOA had not only overplayed their hand but potentially committed fraud, was when everything changed. I wasn't just an angry farmer anymore. I was a landowner with the law firmly on my side, facing an adversary who had crossed a line that even her wealth and connections couldn't protect her from. The next morning, armed with Frank's findings, I submitted formal documentation to the county commissioner's office citing the agricultural exemption and requesting immediate review of the fence alteration. Frank helped me draft a cease and desist letter, laying out in precise legal language how the HOA had trespassed and damaged my property without legal standing. But we didn't stop there. Frank suggested we file a public records request for all communications between the HOA and county officials regarding my property. The results confirmed our suspicions. There was no approved action plan for my fence. The county enforcement officer had never authorized any action against my farm. The documentation Elizabeth had shown was, as Frank suspected, fabricated. "This changes everything," Frank said grimly. She used falsified government documentation to authorize destruction of private property. That's a serious matter. We compiled a comprehensive dossier, the original agricultural exemption documents, photographic evidence of the fence dating back to the 1950s, the falsified county approval statement from witnesses, and a detailed timeline of events. Word of our investigation spread quickly through the farming community. Other families came forward with similar stories. The Wilsons had been pressured to move their tractor storage behind visual barrier landscaping. The Thompsons had received violation notices about their traditional red barn needing to be repainted in earth tones to match community aesthetic standards. 3 neighboring agricultural families provided formal affidavits describing their own encounters with the Meadow Vista HOA, warning letters about equipment visibility, complaints about agricultural odors, demands to remove structures visible from subdivision roads. The pattern was becoming clear. Systematic pressure on agricultural properties bordering Meadow Vista, always with the same justification of property values and community standards. Most interesting was what we discovered about Elizabeth Harrington herself. Frank had connections with HOA oversight boards in surrounding counties and made some discreet inquiries. Before moving to our community, Elizabeth had served on an HOA board in Riverside County where multiple homeowners had filed complaints about her overzealous enforcement. One family had even obtained a restraining order after she repeatedly photographed their non-compliant property from a street. But the truly shocking revelation came when we looked into property transactions around Meadow Vista. Elizabeth's husband, James Harrington, worked for Meridian Regional Development, the same company that had purchased the Johnson property to create Meadow Vista. More disturbing, Meridian had recently acquired the Henderson property after they'd been forced to demolish their historic barn. "This isn't about property values, it's a land grab," Frank declared, spreading color-coded maps across the table. "Every farm pressure by the HOA has either sold to Meridian or is under contract. They're using community standards as a weapon to force out farmers who've resisted selling for generations." He pointed to expansion plans hidden in public records. Meadow Vista Phase 2 requires acquiring every agricultural parcel surrounding the current development. Elizabeth isn't enforcing rules. She's executing a corporate takeover with her husband as the beneficiary. They're not protecting a community. They're manufacturing a monopoly. "We need to be careful," Frank cautioned. "These are serious allegations involving powerful local interests. But the evidence is compelling." With Frank's guidance, we prepared our strategy for the next HOA meeting, scheduled for the following Tuesday evening. This time, I wouldn't attend as a supplicant begging for understanding. I'd come armed with the full force of the law and evidence of potentially criminal misrepresentation. In the meantime, we took a calculated risk and shared our findings with Sheriff Davidson, an old-school lawman who had known my family for decades. He reviewed the documentation with a deepening frown. "This is concerning, Tom. Very concerning. I'll have a word with the county prosecutor about the falsified documentation. That crosses a line." He handed the papers back to me. "In the meantime, do what you need to do at that HOA meeting. Just keep it civil." The Meadow Vista Community Center was packed beyond capacity when I arrived with Frank at my side. News of our investigation had spread, drawing curious residents, local farmers, and even a camera crew from the regional news station. People stood along the walls and crowded the doorway, all waiting to see what would happen. Elizabeth sat at the center of the board table, immaculately dressed as always, discussing a proposal to standardize mailbox designs as if nothing unusual was happening. She barely acknowledged my presence, though I noticed her eyes flickering to the thick portfolio Frank carried under his arm. The meeting proceeded with mechanical efficiency through routine business, approval of previous minutes, treasurer's report, landscaping committee updates. Finally, after nearly 40 minutes of mundane administrative matters, they reached the public comments portion of the agenda. "I believe Mr. Miller wishes to address the fence compliance action," Elizabeth said, her tone suggesting this was a minor nuisance to be quickly dispatched before moving on to more important matters. I approached the microphone, Frank beside me with our documentation. The room fell silent. "I'm here about more than just my fence," I began, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "I'm here about illegal trespass, property damage, deliberate misrepresentation of county authority, and what appears to be a systematic campaign against agricultural properties surrounding Meadow Vista estates." Elizabeth's professional smile tightened. "Mr. Miller, we've already addressed the fence compliance issue. No, I interrupted firmly. You haven't. And now you're going to listen. Frank opened his portfolio and distributed 3 key documents to each board member. The township charter with agricultural exemptions highlighted in yellow, the cease and desist letter with its legal citations, and printouts comparing Elizabeth's falsified county approval with actual county documentation formats. Section 12.4 of the original township charter, I said, holding up my own copy. It explicitly states that agricultural land is exempt from residential covenants created after its establishment. My farm has operated continuously since 1952, decades before Meadow Vista existed. The board members began examining the documents with growing concern. Elizabeth attempted to maintain control. These are merely historical documents, she insisted. Our covenant supersedes. It doesn't, Frank interjected smoothly, his voice carrying the quiet authority of decades in legal practice. State law is explicit on this matter. Pre-existing agricultural operations are grandfathered and exempt from retroactive restrictions imposed by residential developments. I pulled out the enlarged photographs of my fence dating back to the 1950s, establishing its historical presence. This wasn't just a fence. This was protected historical agricultural infrastructure, explicitly excluded from HOA jurisdiction by county ordinance. Then came the moment we'd prepared for. I placed the enlarged copy of the fake county approval on the table, side by side with the actual county documentation format. Mrs. Harrington claimed to have county authorization for cutting my fence. She showed what appeared to be an official county email on her phone to numerous witnesses. The county has confirmed in writing that no such authorization exists or was ever requested. A murmur spread through the room. Elizabeth's face visibly paled, but she maintained her composure. Furthermore, Frank continued, his voice now carrying the weight of serious legal implications, misrepresenting government authorization to conduct property destruction could constitute criminal fraud. And by authorizing contractors to trespass and damage property without proper legal standing, the HOA board members could potentially face personal liability. The protection of the HOA as a corporate entity doesn't shield individuals from unlawful actions taken knowingly. Elizabeth started to speak, but the HOA's attorney, present for routine matters and clearly caught off guard by these developments, placed a warning hand on her arm. He requested a 5-minute recess. It stretched to 20 as they huddled in a corner, voices occasionally rising. I used this time to distribute copies of the agricultural exemption documentation to interested residents. Many expressed shock at the tactics used against my property. I had no idea they didn't have proper authority, one woman whispered. They made it sound so official. Another resident, a retired engineer, examined the falsified document closely. This is deliberately misleading. The letterhead and format match county communications, but the content has been altered. When the board reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The vice president, not Elizabeth, addressed the room. The board recognizes there has been a serious oversight regarding Mr. Miller's property status under township regulations. We will be conducting an internal investigation into the approval process for this enforcement action and will cooperate fully with any county inquiries. Elizabeth remained silent, her expression unreadable. But I wasn't finished. There's more, I said, nodding to Frank, who distributed our final document, a map showing the pattern of agricultural property acquisitions by Meridian Development following HOA enforcement actions. Every farm facing HOA violations has received lowball purchase offers from Meridian Development within weeks, I stated, sliding printed records across the table. The Hendersons lost their historic barn to your enforcement, then sold to Meridian at 40% below market value. The Wilsons, currently facing your $100 daily fines, received a Meridian contract yesterday. I paused, letting the pattern sink in before delivering the knockout. Records show Meridian Development's Director of Property Acquisition is James Harrington, your husband. The revelation hit like a thunderclap. Gasps and muttered curses rippled through the crowd. Board members physically recoiled from Elizabeth, whose porcelain composure finally cracked, showing the panic beneath. The HOA attorney, looking increasingly alarmed, requested another recess. This one lasted 30 minutes, during which Elizabeth could be seen making urgent phone calls in the hallway. When they returned, the HOA's attorney addressed the room directly. The board has determined that an immediate independent review of all enforcement actions against non-HOA properties is warranted. Pending that review, all outstanding violation notices against agricultural properties are suspended. Regarding Mr. Miller's fence, the board acknowledges that the enforcement action may have been taken without proper jurisdiction or authority. Elizabeth sat silently, her face a mask. When the attorney finished, she gathered her papers and walked out of the meeting without a word, leaving her position at the center of the table conspicuously empty. The resolution came swifter than I anticipated. The following morning, I received a formal letter from the HOA's attorney acknowledging that my property fell under agricultural exemptions and was not subject to HOA covenants. They offered to cover the full cost of restoring my fence to its original condition, plus $15,000 in damages for the inconvenience, loss of security, and emotional distress. Elizabeth submitted her resignation as HOA president that same day, citing unspecified personal reasons. Two other board members who had been most involved in agricultural property enforcement actions followed suit within the week. The county prosecutor's office opened an investigation into the misrepresentation of government authority. While criminal charges were never filed, Elizabeth claimed the email had been mistakenly modified during forwarding. The investigation revealed a troubling pattern of selective enforcement against properties bordering Meadow Vista. Most significantly, the county prosecutor launched a formal investigation into Meridian Development's predatory acquisition tactics. Our evidence proved decisive. James Harrington had systematically targeted farms weakened by his wife's HOA enforcement actions, with internal company emails revealing their strategy to leverage compliance costs to accelerate acquisition. The company's planned expansion of Meadow Vista into surrounding agricultural lands was not merely put on hold. It was permanently blocked by emergency zoning protections enacted specifically in response to our case. Elizabeth and James Harrington sold their home in Meadow Vista and relocated to another state within a month, their perfect lawn sprouting a for sale sign almost overnight. The local rumor mill suggested they'd left not just to escape the scandal, but because Meridian had terminated James's position after the negative publicity. The story took an unexpected turn when investigative reporting by the Liberty County Gazette revealed that 3 other local HOAs where Elizabeth had previously served had similar patterns of aggressive enforcement against agricultural properties, followed by development company purchases of distressed land. The article earned reporter Melissa Jenkins a regional journalism award and prompted a statewide review of HOA enforcement practices against agricultural properties. After the dust settled, an unexpected knock at my door revealed Sarah Henderson, whose family had lost their historic barn, standing with a fresh apple pie and tears in her eyes. "We should have fought like you did," she said simply. "They're not coming back, you know." Elizabeth and James put their house up for sale yesterday. The news spread faster than wildfire through drought-dry grass. The next morning, a tentative procession of Meadow Vista residents approached my property line, the new HOA president leading a dozen families carrying tools, lumber, and homemade food. "We moved here because we loved this countryside," the young mother at the front explained as her children gazed wide-eyed at my cattle. "We never wanted war with the people who make this land special. We've come to rebuild what was broken, if you'll let us." That fence-raising day bridged more than property lines. Every nail driven reconnected a community fractured by corporate greed. This sentiment seemed widespread among the actual residents, many of whom had been intimidated into silence by Elizabeth's aggressive leadership style. With her gone, a different community spirit emerged, one that valued cooperation over confrontation. One family, the Richardsons, with 2 young children, asked if their kids could visit the farm to learn about agriculture. "They think food comes from grocery stores," Mr. Richardson explained with a self-deprecating smile. "We'd like them to understand what really happens before that." This sparked an idea. Using part of the settlement money, I established the Willow Creek Agricultural Heritage Trust, dedicated to educating suburban neighbors about farming traditions and sustainable practices. Within months, we secured a state grant for historical preservation of agricultural landmarks, starting with fully restoring my grandfather's original fence design and the Hendersons' demolished barn, which we rebuilt on their property as an educational space for community workshops. My grandfather's fence, once nearly destroyed, now stands taller than ever, protected by the newly enacted Agricultural Heritage Protection Act. Tourists and legal students alike stop to read the bronze plaque that tells our story. Elizabeth Harrington's name doesn't appear on it, but every local knows this truth. When corporate greed wielded chainsaws against a farmer's legacy, they discovered too late that deeper than any fence post, stronger than any property covenant, runs the root of justice that connects us all to the land we love.